I'm really pleased that the Beinecke has given me this opportunity to share a few thoughts about Portolan charts, especially a few of the Portuguese charts in the collection. The Beinecke is fortunate to have in its collection the very earliest signed and dated Portuguese chart, which we'll be seeing in a few minutes. Now, for the bulk of my own 20-year effort to try to understand this genre, I spent most of my efforts on the subject of the process of collecting and transmitting geographic information to the authors of these very first charts in the 13th century, and the role that navigation has played in that process. But today, I'd like to set those questions aside and focus on an aspect only peripherally related to navigation. I'd like to address the question of the role played by these charts in the furtherance of national, territorial, and economic expansion in the late medieval, early Renaissance period. And I've chosen Portugal as the case study. But before examining Portugal's story, I'd like to provide a little bit of background. For their first 150 years, the primary function of Portolan charts was to support commercial shipping in the Med Sea and nearby waters. Now, Portugal has no Med Sea ports and did not participate significantly in these activities. So there are no surviving Portuguese charts of these areas from the period of the 13th, 14th centuries. The European trade in Eastern goods was dominated by Venice and Genoa, and both of these city-states established trading posts and relationships in support of the trade. However, the logistics were not very efficient. And if you looked at the ratio of prices between the production point in the east and the docks of Venice or Genoa, those ratios were astronomical. Recognized or not by Portugal at the time, this pricing disparity would present a huge economic opportunity for the Portuguese, if and when a seaborne alternative was developed, especially for a country like Portugal with ports on the ocean. Imagine a camel carrying 100 kilograms across the sands of the Silk Road versus 1,000 tons in the hold of a Portuguese ship. So, with this background in mind, let's talk about Portuguese territorial and economic expansion, which began in the late 14th century with sporadic adventures aimed at the Atlantic islands, for example, Madeira, Porto Santo, and the Azores. And to demonstrate how the Portuguese visualized these Atlantic islands and navigated to them, I'd like to show one of the most important charts from the Beinecke collection. This chart by Jorge Aguiar of 1492 is the earliest surviving Portuguese chart, which was signed and dated. And the discovery and exploitation of these islands were largely the result of opportunistic encounters rather than part of a planned, organized national effort. And these islands were initially valued as offshore agricultural colonies rather than providing opportunities for trade. The organized effort to expand Portugal's economic reach began in earnest in 1412 when Prince Henry ordered his first exploring and trading expedition along the African coast. Now, by this time, the coast down to the Canary Islands was well charted, and the knowledge of the coast was generally available in the Med Sea ports. This Mallorcan chart by Messia de Valadestes documents the European knowledge of the African coast down to that point. And this detail shows what was known about the coast by European mariners prior to the Portuguese project. You see Cape Bojador, and it had long been seen as a navigational and psychological barrier, and European ships had never passed it until one of Henry's ships, commanded by Gil Ellanes, sailed past that point in 1434. This date effectively represents the beginning of the Portuguese expansion, which would culminate in what later authors have called the Portuguese Seaborne Empire. This expansion was to begin on the west coast of Africa, then across the Atlantic to Brazil, into the Indian Ocean, the countries of the east coast of Africa, to India itself, Ceylon, Malacca, the East Indies, Macau in China, and finally to Kyushu in Japan. The first part of this story was the exploration and economic exploitation of the coasts of West Africa from Cape Bojador, near the Canary Islands, south to the Cape of Good Hope. It seems unlikely at this point that the route to India was seen as a goal. Prince Henry enjoyed a royal monopoly for West African trade, and he seemed content with that. The ships sailed in small groups and were designed for coastal service and proved to be ideal for exploring and charting the coast and the wide river mouths that dotted that coast. But incredibly, not even one single Portuguese chart that was produced in the first 4 decades of this project survives. Now, there must have been charts, so the fact that none survives is curious, and there is no universally accepted explanation. However, we do have 2 surviving Italian works, certainly based on Portuguese information, that offer a credible indication of what the Portuguese charts must have looked like in that period. Andres Bianco was an officer aboard a Venetian ship, and he made several commercial trips from Venice to London. In 1448, his ship had a layover in Lisbon, and this gave Bianco the opportunity to obtain information on Portuguese explorations of this west coast of Africa. This information was largely in the form of a Portolan chart. Now, during his 3-month wait for cargo in London, Bianco drew his own highly detailed chart, which terminates at Cabo Verde, a prominent point that's been discovered only 3 years before his chart. The density of place names on this coast, a total of 81, is a good indication of its authenticity. It's probably, in fact, actually copied from one of the Portuguese charts. Now, this Bianco chart is significant for several aspects. First, it provides the only surviving cartographic record of the Portuguese exploration up to 1448. Second, it's the first Portolan chart drawn in England. Next one, by the way, about 1570. And it's significant even if it was drawn by a Venetian and based entirely on Portuguese information. And in the extreme southern edge of the chart offers an enticing hint of undiscovered lands to the southwest. Not particularly germane to the exploration of the coast of Africa, but it's interesting nonetheless. So you see that little piece of land, and you see the comment on it, or the tagline. And the meaning of that small tip of land and the words have been debated over the decades. The text can be translated in 2 different ways. First, you can say authentic island 1,500 miles distant from here. Or it could be translated, has been translated, authentic island 1,500 miles long. Now, no one is suggesting that the Portuguese originator of this note actually made a 1,500-mile side trip. Whatever the inclusion of this coastline is intended to mean, it is likely obtained from a local person. Now, just for reference, the actual distance from Cabo Verde to the closest point on the South American coast is about 2,500 miles. So if the 1,500 miles does refer to a distance, what it really means is a very long way from here. Another important report on the Portuguese expansion of this coast of West Africa is a series of Portolan atlases drawn between 1465 and 1471 by Grazioso Benincasa of Ancona, a major port on the Italian coast of the Adriatic Sea. The 1468 atlas is unusual in that it covers the entire eastern shores of the Atlantic, all the way from Scotland to Sierra Leone in Africa. In this slide, I've stitched together the charts that cover the African coast from a latitude of 37 degrees, which is basically Portugal, down to 7.5 degrees. We can zoom in and see that the continuation of the coastline after the Bianco chart of 1448, which, as you recall, ended in Cabo Verde. While these atlases provided important information on Portuguese explorations of the African coast, they do raise questions about how Benincasa obtained such detailed navigational information. Because in this period, he was producing a steady stream of charts and atlases, all signed and dated in Italy. And it's clear that he never left Italy during that period. The source of the information was undoubtedly Portuguese, and the specifics of how the information flowed to Benincasa in Italy has never been satisfactorily resolved. Finally, we come to the earliest surviving Portuguese chart. This one predates the one I showed at the beginning, the 1492, which was the first signed and dated chart. This one is not signed and dated, but Portuguese scholars have provided a credible estimate of the date, circa 1472, based on the extent of the coastline that's represented. Now, as we've seen, under the guidance of Prince Henry, the emphasis had been on exploiting trade along the coast. For example, the great fort at Elmina, illustrated in the 16th century chart by Lázaro Luis, was built in 1482. And it served the growing trade with the local peoples in that area, and also became a major resupply depot for Portuguese ships making the long voyage to Asia in the 16th century. But by the 1480s, the focus of the exploration of this coast was evolving. Locating the pathway to the east was explicitly stated as the objective, and that, of course, depended upon finding the southern cape of Africa and crossing it. This was achieved in 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias passed the southern tip of Africa, which he named the Cape of Good Hope. And with Vasco da Gama's successful voyages into India in a few years later, the potential of trade for the unique products of the East would dwarf the West African trade. And this small country of Portugal poured resources into the project on a massive scale. Instead of 2 or 3 small ships for coastal exploration and trading, the oceanic fleets serving the East sometimes numbered well over a dozen, and the ships became huge by the standards of the day, with displacements exceeding 1,000 tons. As an example of the scale of the Portuguese commitment, we can see the scope of the fleet of da Gama's second voyage to India in 1502, captured in this book by Luis Arte Abreu. Note the 18 ships, some of quite large capacity, and each ship was pictured along with the name of the skipper. The book was maintained in Goa, India, which had become the capital of Portuguese Asia. And every fleet from the year 1500 to 1565 was added to this valuable book. This is a ship captained by Vasco, of the fleet, Vasco da Gama. You can see Fernão da Gama's name below. And the chart makers were challenged also to provide the tools necessary to guide these fleets into the Indian Ocean and beyond. No European ships had ever been in this area. And just as in the exploitation of the west coast of Africa, the charts could be seen in 2 different ways. First, as a record of the early voyages, but secondly, as navigational tools for all future voyages. And they surely had more value to the Portuguese in this second sense. This phase began in earnest with Vasco da Gama's voyages early in the 16th century and continued for about 80 years until most of the coast and islands of the East were pretty well documented. The oldest surviving chart to depict this Portuguese progress is this chart, drawn about 1510 by a Portuguese Jorge Renel. Now you can note the blue Portuguese banners here. I've circled those in red, which would multiply during the next 75 years. And already we can see the land masses and larger islands beginning to take form in a way never before depicted on any European chart. Now there are some anomalies. For example, the huge Red Sea in Northeast Africa, the erroneous guesses as to the exact positions and size of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. But the coast of East Africa, Madagascar, India, Ceylon were all pretty well presented. And note this latitude scale, a novel and quite useful aid for navigators. As the 16th century progressed, Portugal aggressively expanded its influence in the East. Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, just up the coast from Singapore, was an important trading center, then under the control of the Sultan Mahmud Shah. It fell to the Portuguese in 1511, and this battle dramatically increased Portuguese trade and opened the rest of East Indies and the China coast to Portuguese expansion. The Molucca Islands, known to be the center of spice production, were next, then Macau, and finally the trading post on the western Japanese island of Kyushu. I'd like to show two Portuguese atlases that demonstrate the evolution of Portuguese cartography in this part of the world. The first was drawn by Francisco Rodrigues, who documented the voyage from Europe to the Portuguese-controlled areas of India, then up the coast of the South China Sea toward China and Japan. But after passing the Cape of Good Hope, the charts in this atlas became far more notional than detailed and precise. His goal was to survey the vast area he had traversed and report in general terms what he found. This chart, drawn by Rodrigues in about 1513, is typical of the Rodrigues Atlas. The sketch-like chart depicts several islands which are now Indonesia. And although not a product of a rigorous survey, the geography is recognizable. The eastern part of Java, Bali, Lombok, and the eastern part of Borneo are more or less in their correct position. But in many ways, Japan was the biggest prize. Portugal never acquired sovereignty over any part of Japan, but that was not their objective. It was trade and religious evangelism that mattered. And in this case of Japan, the Portuguese encountered a perfect opportunity. In the mid-16th century, the Portuguese had made an agreement with the Ming Dynasty that allowed them to open a trading establishment at Macau near Hong Kong. Now, because direct trade between China and Japan was not allowed for political, diplomatic reasons, Portugal was able to serve as a trading intermediary between the two. They supplied Chinese goods obtained in Macau to Japan in exchange for Japanese silver. The trade depended upon the monsoon winds, which blew from the southwest to the northeast for half the year, perfect for the trip from Macau to Kyushu. But then in the opposite direction, the other half of the year for the return trip. Each year, a single Portuguese ship, like the one depicted in this Japanese non-bond screen, would travel with the monsoon to the newly established Portuguese trading post in Kyushu. It would be laden with the highly coveted Chinese goods, which would be exchanged for Japanese silver, and the trip would return when the monsoon changed. The Japanese silver made this intermediary trading function extremely profitable, continued for almost 100 years, and provided enormous wealth for the Portuguese. Now, in 1580, King Philip II of Spain also assumed the crown of Portugal. And this event coincides with the zenith of Portugal's empire in the east. This chart from an atlas drawn by Fernão Vaz Dourado in 1580 captures the grandeur of the Portuguese interest in Asia. And because of the time limits today, we did not touch on the Portuguese story in Brazil. But here too, the Portolan charts led the way for a very lucrative period. In this case, Portugal did claim sovereignty over Brazil, which eventually became its largest colony. These three charts from the 17th and 18th century, all Portuguese charts, are in the Beinecke collections, and they're quite interesting. This unsigned work is the navigational chart which shows the centrality of the South Atlantic Ocean to Portugal and their interests, not only for Africa and the way to the Far East, but also to South America. This chart is signed by José Fernandes Portugal, and it was used for coastal navigation, documenting important ports along the Brazilian coast. And this last one is interesting from the point of view of its physical aspects. The chart by Simão Pinheiro da Rosa has all of the attributes of a Portolan chart. Stylistically, it is a Portolan chart, but it is a member of a rare class of chart because it's actually printed on vellum. And of course, by definition, a Portolan chart is a manuscript chart drawn on vellum. So initially we had manuscript charts drawn on vellum, and then eventually we had charts printed on paper. This one is kind of an intermediary spot. Beinecke is fortunate to have in their collection these four Portuguese charts, which range in dates from 1492 to 1786. I'd like to conclude with these points. First, the Portuguese global expansion was literally unprecedented in its day. Take a look at this map. It summarizes in chronology the geography of this remarkable story. It represents decades of dedication to what was a challenging but ultimately profitable project, full of human stories, achievements and failures, discoveries and shipwrecks, war and peace. Secondly, the fact that the population of Portugal was less than 1 million people when the project began makes this all the more amazing. And in fact, I've read that of those who went out to Asia with the Portuguese ships, less than half ever returned. Some, of course, stayed in leadership positions, but many perished coming or going or in wars. From the beginning, under the auspices of Prince Henry, to reaching its peak required about 150 years and literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And during that time, many factors played a part in this achievement, but navigational excellence was fundamental. And I can say with confidence that the manuscript sea charts, these Portolan charts, were in the forefront of their success. So I'd like to thank you very much. And I think, Michael, we may have time for a few questions.